This is the first talk on a series which will probably amplify out to a series of 3 on knowledge. It's not a talk, it's a conversation. It's actually more of a conversation than we've had so far on Gospel Conversations. And it's a conversation between my good friend Mark Strom and me. Mark's an old favourite at Gospel Conversation, and his views have really framed how I think and framed a lot of the curriculum and approach to the gospel we have in Gospel Conversations. So we're really, really glad that Mark's back on track to give us some of his wisdom. The headline of this particular series is really intriguing, which is that faith, hope, and love are categories of knowing, not categories of morality. And that really immediately plays with what we might think knowledge might be. We've grown up in an era where knowledge is scientized. It's turned into data and information, and somewhat stigmatized. But Mark believes that when Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, very famous passage apparently on love, and he finishes by saying very famously that there remains 3 of faith, hope and love, but the greatest of these is love. Mark believes that he's actually talking about ways of knowing, not about ethical or moral qualities. So faith, hope and love are best understood as paradigms of knowing rather than as discrete moral qualities. So that's intriguing, and it intrigued me from the moment I heard it. So this topic obviously fits very well with the theme that we've woven in and out of this year in Gospel Conversations. The interview with Esther Meek is probably the headline of that, and we're looking forward to seeing her next year. And the approach Mark's going to talk about is very much in sympathy with her very systematic reframing of knowledge. It does build on Mark Ridgway's talks on artificial intelligence. I mean, we're in an age where we seriously are considering that computers can think, quote unquote. So Mark's talks there are very helpful in giving us some groundwork to not just dispute that, but interact with that aura of artificial intelligence. They also will, Mark, this conversation will tie in very powerfully with the talks I gave on discipleship. The theme that evolved in the talks was discipleship. The topic was the creation gospel. And I said we need a new paradigm of discipleship that takes it out of its pietistic moral boxes and gives it a bigger framework. and this conversation will really contribute to that. So I think it's going to be a series that you will really enjoy. You could ask why we're so interested in knowledge in Gospel Conversations. I think the answer to that's pretty obvious, but suffice it to say that Gospel Conversations, by its nature, is a forum for inquiry and exploration. And it is framed out of a picture, an anthropology of humanity as being distinguished by being in the image of God. And the thing that most distinguishes us by being in the image of God is what we could variously call mind, reason, soul. Different eras have used different words. But there's a category in us, there's a quality in us and a capability in us. That is our capability to think. However, the concept of thinking and the concept of knowledge today, in the day that we live in, has very bad press, really. I think it's stigmatized as head knowledge, that's something that's academic and dry. Certainly, there's a very strong movement within Christianity and evangelical Christianity that you could call anti-intellectual. And Mark Knoll wrote a profound book critiquing the evangelical culture. It's called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, I think, and the scandal is that it's anti-intellectual. The sort of emphasis on feelings and experience, important as it is, tends to degrade knowledge. And knowledge is put in a dry, arid box of study or head knowledge that doesn't affect your life. So, knowledge is not sort of sexy in Christian circles. To some extent, that problem has arisen because knowledge has boxed itself into a corner by surrendering its soul to science, which we would say is really the legacy of the Enlightenment, the Cartesian model of thought as objectified rational thought. So rationality has raised its head as a totally empirical view of life based on proof. And what that's led to is the terrible dichotomy in the modern world between faith and reason. And so many people think that's your choice on both sides of the camp, Christian, non-Christian, or people who are yet to be Christians. I don't like the phrase non-Christian. If anyone can think of a better one, please tell me, but let's call them pre-Christian. What that tells me is something's wrong with the very paradigms with which we're discussing this concept of knowledge. And that's what Mark gives us. Mark gives us, and I think Esther will do the same next year from a different angle, but Mark gives us a new paradigm, new framework to think much more freshly, much more creatively about knowledge. So let me conclude by this short introduction by saying a word about Mark, and really it's about Mark and me. We're best friends. Mark was the first person who joined me in my employment in Second Road. But in many ways, I don't think anyone has so profoundly and positively influenced me in my thinking in the gospel than Mark has. What Mark did was, when we met when we were much, much younger, he was able to give more framework to what I understood intuitively, because Mark is actually trained in theology. He went to Westminster, which is very interesting because it's a very profoundly intellectual reformed school, but also in philosophy. And Mark introduced to me the world of philosophy and sort of gave me the foundations that I could move off on. And I was thinking about what I would try to say about Mark and my relationship and the way it's forged how we think and talk. And that's what you're going to get. You're going to get an insight into in this talk, because it's a real talk. It's a snapshot of talks Mark and I have had over the last 30 years. I would summarise it into about 4 major themes that dominated our talks. And the first was radical grace. We really felt that Christianity veered to legalism the whole time. And so radical grace is a profound theme of Mark's. And he developed that in the Gospel Conversation talks on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The second was what this one's about: epistemology, philosophy. How do we know what we know? The tone of that discussion was so fresh to me because it took the gospel out of this suffocating religious box and put it into the whole of life. And so when I talk about epistemology, that sounds very dry, but it wasn't dry. And you'll hear us talk about this, basing our conversation on knowledge on the work we were doing, for instance, in rewriting tax law as consultants. But I would say that, one of the profoundest things Mark has said, and it came in a Gospel Conversations talk and a question at the end, is that, and I think it only occurred to him at the time, he said that we make a tremendous mistake with the concept of application in the Christian world, probably more broadly. In other words, at the end of every sermon that I hear, there's the last 1/3 has got to be an application, like how do you implement this, whatever truth it is. And it always feels forced to me. It always seems to inevitably go down into stereotypes of behaviour that just leave your heart heavy. And what Mark said was, that's the wrong thing. What we need is discovery. We need to discover and uncover the seam of glory in all of reality. That's where it all begins. So when I say we were talking about philosophy and epistemology, I think, if you put those words into a bigger framework, it's trying to recover and uncover the mystery in life, the surprising, stunning mystery in life. And it's seamless. You see it everywhere. You begin to see the mystery and the glory everywhere. You no longer have religious categories. So that's the second area that Mark gave a framework to in my life and the life of others. The third one is very significant, which is reframing the Bible and the gospel as story, narrative, rather than as a systematic treatise. And thus, this becomes a literary way of handling the Bible as narrative, a narrative in which the point of the narrative, the theme of the narrative, the drive of the narrative, the climax will be the person called Jesus Christ, who wraps it all together and introduces the denouement, the so what. The last way that Mark, I think, helped legitimize a lot of the flexible ways I intuitively, as someone trained in poetry and literature, like looking at the Bible, was the concept of multi-perspectival thinking. That the way we approach reality is through multiple perspectives, often roads carved by imagery, and that's fine. The Bible does the same thing. So that package of themes, you will see a lot of that coming up in this talk. This first talk is introductory, and I think it needs to be introductory, because by that I mean we spend a fair amount of time looking at, well, what's the problem with the word knowledge? And I think we talk a lot about it from in a far-reaching discourse chat that takes this word and makes it more vital, more powerful. Today, for goodness sake, what we're seeing in America tells us that knowledge is incredibly important, because knowledge is what we do. The knowing is the human side. The corollary of that is truth. That's the object of knowledge, is to find truth. So we're dealing with truth here. And in a day where truth seems to be challenged even as a possibility by the fake news, conspiracy theory, disease, really, that unfortunately a lot of the more right-wing Christian side of social media seems to endorse, has made people realise how fragile it is if you take away this thing called truth, how fragile it makes all of life. So once you take knowledge and put it into that broader framework, you begin to see, well, why is it important? What's problematic? And we talk a lot about that in this upcoming conversation. So I commend it to you and trust you'll enjoy it. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Tony. This is good to be with you, man.
Good to be with you. It's been a long journey, and we're going to talk about something really interesting.
Yeah, I was only thinking the other day about just how long this partnership's been going. I think it was something like 84 or 85 or something.
Well, I think it's worthwhile as a bit of context, because what we're going to be talking about is knowledge. And we're going to be talking about a new paradigm of knowledge through the lens of faith, hope, and love, which is a insight that you had a long time ago, and we'll come to that in a moment. However, I think it's worthwhile explaining to everybody a little bit of our joint journey, because that joint journey began, as you say, in the 1980s, but we worked together professionally.
Yeah.
I was a refugee from teaching, plunging out into the world of consulting, and not quite knowing what I was doing, and you joined and asked if you could join. And so we had this two guys not knowing what they were doing relationship. But the kind of tasks we began doing, we did a lot of what would today be called technical writing, but we did it in a far more creative way, in a more strategic way. But nonetheless, we had very, very, in a sense, concrete tasks like rewriting, redesigning a procurement manual, or I can remember a risk management manual you did, or
the defibrillator one that you did.
Or the defibrillator one. And so we were dealing with very, very complex, generally scientific, technical information, but we were bringing a artistic lens to it. So the whole issue of what on earth, quote unquote, knowledge is, because our clients were knowledge industries, in other words, heavy technical industries. So we had this hands-on experience of the task of crafting knowledge, but largely, I think, through you and probably David Jones, we began to look at that task through a theological lens, putting it simply, what is knowledge as part of the created order? So
I think too that we both from different places had such a strong instinct to go, to really ask questions about the people before we asked questions about the content. So, you'd done a lot of amazing stuff with kids, teaching kids, how to think really through, sort of the Trojan horse was teaching them how to write, but it was really about teaching them how to think. And from my own part, I don't know, there was just some sort of instinct that said, when someone gives you a 50 or 100 page dense document, just something says to you, not first and foremost, this is a poorly written document, but the first instinct was, this can't work for people. Surely this can't work for people. What are they actually trying to do? And as you and I from different places, we just kind of burrowed into what are these people trying to say and trying to do? How does this thing actually function for them? And it was through that we ended up, being able to dramatically reduce the amount of pages and put, 10 pages into one diagram and all that sort of stuff that we did. And it was really about this, it was the knowledge question.
Well, it was, and we began to realize that in human enterprises, particularly today, knowledge is far from being some peripheral thing that you kind of paper around an organization. It actually was the organization. We view, there are two things, as you were saying, that I saw. Number one, knowledge is power. And we begin to see it's a real power game. Who's got the knowledge and who hasn't got the knowledge became incredibly important. So you and I were both wanting to introduce the user in and take the professional expertise out of the knowledge. So for instance, we did the tax law improvement project, which was in a sense democratizing legislation so ordinary people could understand it. But this was resisted by the lawyers because obfuscation was their money, but what we were doing all the time, among many other things, of course, one of the movements that really informed us was the plain English movement. And as you know, the heart of the plain English movement essentially is to personalize the sentence. Introduce I and you into it and make it personal rather than it is thought that, which objectifies everything. And
it's a really incredible thing, isn't it? Like you can get a dense paragraph of writing, and if you don't know any other technique or insight about how language works, if you just, as you said, if you just introduce I and you deliberately go about putting that wherever it belongs in the paragraph, you just magically kind of the thing becomes clear.
It becomes clear.
The person is introduced. It's amazing.
It becomes accountable. Now, just so everybody knows how important this is, the project that we're just at the moment alluding to, one of many, was called the Tax Law Improvement Project, where the tax office and the government wanted to essentially reduce the vast complexity of law by getting the Office of Parliamentary Counsel to redraft the law in plain English terms. And I was the main consultant working with the wonderful Tom Reed, who was the lawyer on that. And the whole idea of opening the language up by introducing people was so we wanted to introduce into law the words I and you, or we and you, or the government and you, right? We're moving from the third person to the second person. It was so controversial, it needed an act of parliament to allow it to happen.
Yeah.
Is it okay to say this in law? And then you begin to realise, well, this is not a game, because A, it makes things understandable, but B, it changes, it democratises information, it makes it accountable. And I just love using the example, it has been decided to fire you, third person, objectified, as opposed, well, who decided to fire me? So we were aware, I think, of course, looking on this, we were aware that Jesus is called the Logos, this metaphor of the word was not inconsequential in the Greco-Roman world. It was a big thing, and language and its closeness to anthropology and identity and its closeness to power and reality became vastly interesting to us. And you in particular, and then you were teaching me philosophy and I was catching up. So we both ended up with our PhDs, but really for this conversation, I think it's worthwhile people knowing it began in a very grounded experience where words and how they work and humanizing them was our game, with wonderful clients who had to be brave to do it. Yeah. But we were a bit naive because we didn't realize how political it was, how important it was. But as we realized it, we became more strategic. But I think that's a good segue into knowledge, because
I think the other thing about it too, Tony, is that, we were also doing some fairly conventional things in terms of, we'd started the community, and so there were teaching, biblical teaching type sessions that you and I were sharing. But the conversations between that context and the tax and other type contexts, for you and me, the conversations were seamless. They just kept going backwards and forwards. It wasn't just about a one-way, here we are trying to translate theology into this other world. It was both directions. And in fact, our understanding of, logos and whatever else and what we were seeing in the scriptures was actually being informed and changed quite a lot by what we were seeing of the stunning significance of this.
It was, and as you say, it was a two-way flow where, I just keep going back to that story, which began to illuminate me at the time. There's two stories. One's the burning bush, and the other's Jacob and the ladder between heaven and earth. Like Jacob's in the desert and he thinks, I'm absolutely in secular world, God's nowhere near. And then he has this dream of, this was the house of God and I didn't know it. And you and I both began to have this experience. We thought we were out in quote unquote secular world, dealing with large corporates and huge bureaucracies, quite close to the centers of power. And we woke up thinking, actually God was in this place. All of life is theological. You cannot talk about knowledge and data without it's really drawing on the resources of the gospel and the illumination of the gospel.
Interesting. I remember one story from that time with the Tax Law Improvement Project. My own story was working with that lovely fellow Graham, and we'd hit this place of we were stumped about how to simplify this particular piece of legislation and its implications. At the same time, in parallel, we've been having this conversation. It was really about his family, his life and his family, and real struggles he was going through. And I suggested this particular Friday afternoon, let's go for a walk. So here, this very senior taxation person and myself, off we go walking around Canberra. And by the time we got back to the office, we'd kind of cracked both of them. Like he had a new sense of what he was going to do in his own personal life, but we'd cracked the issue that we were trying to figure out in terms of tax law. And which is, again, a nice segue in that, you can't know truly if you distance yourself. You have to engage, and you have to engage with a person as much as with a topic, with an idea.
Yeah, well, that's a great, I think, pretext to what we're about to talk about. It's not really a pretext. I think it informs it. So what I thought I might do is share a sketch, which is the ABCD sketch.
A bit strange for you and I to talk for very long without one of us drawing. So
correct. We absolutely love sketching reality. So I'm going to put this up on the screen, and hopefully everyone can see what I can see. Can you see the sketch?
Yeah, it's great. If you want to put it on full screen, we can see it in all its glory.
Okay, I'm trying to put it. Oh, there it goes. Is that full of screen?
Yeah.
This is a model that is the ABCD model, which is our model for an argument, which we've elevated into a strategy model. And it's been a powerful heuristic for many very large organisations. Not the space to go into it now, but as we were talking about this topic and what you had to say, which I thought was quite breathtaking, it formed in my mind as the structure of an argument. And the structure of an argument is over here, what we call the A space is what's problematic and promising, what's our current situation. And the B is what is our vision, where does this all go towards? And that A to B frames the argument. And then the big idea is the C. So how are you going to get from A to B? Well, that's what you could call the lever. And the guts of what we're going to say is actually your big idea. And I think I want to give you credit because I think it is your big idea there in the C space. And then when you've got the big idea and you've absorbed it, you go into what we call D, which is, well, what might I do to take this into the real world, which is how do I apply it, how do I play with it, and so on. So we're going to use this model to guide the conversation, because if we don't use something to guide our conversation, Mark, we'll be here forever and everyone will be impressed but confused.
You're not saying you and I would just ramble, are you?
No, there's no worry about that.
Well, I got to give one caveat up front, and I know in your great love for me, you keep wanting to say this is my new idea. It's basically there's quite a few people who have made some connection between faith, hope, and love and knowledge. After Paul, of course, as we'll get to, but Augustine and a number of other people. But I just don't know. I feel like I have never seen it spelt out as simply as this simple mind has found a way to do it.
Right. Well, I think the other person that I'd like to acknowledge is Esther.
Yeah, absolutely.
Esther is very much doing a similar thing, and probably with a broader scope than you or I, because it's her life. But yeah, I thought there was such a segue between the conversations that we've had with Esther and what you wanted to say that's gave me and us the idea of having this conversation.
Yeah, and I admire her work greatly.
Yeah, and the second segue, which is really important, is that we've been having, I've given some talks on the creation gospel, which you know about, and what I've advanced in that is a new concept of discipleship to try to free us from the idea that discipleship is some kind of religious, pietistic stereotype.
Yeah.
And what I talked about was the discipleship of design, or design as discipleship. And if you frame design as the transformation of situations, there'll be quite a strong segue into this, what we're about to talk about, that I've found helpful. Where we begin is today, we'll sort of skate across the A to B, which will give a context to the conversation. And I'm just going to open up with what I have seen and then get you to respond. And what I've seen is that the word knowledge, quote unquote, is downgraded in Christian circles. You can go where, say, Mark Noll's gone with the scandal of the evangelical mind, that essentially Christianity has this anti-intellectual veering it can't get away from.
Without saying too much, you can kind of see that at the present moment.
You certainly can. And it's probably fed by the artificial polarization between faith and reason. Okay, and I'm on the faith side, so therefore I'm very anti-reason. Mm. And also, I notice just amongst a lot of the Christians I know, it's oh, that's head knowledge. So there's a sort of a stereotyping of knowledge as academic Bible knowledge, not heart knowledge. And there's a contrast. And I know a lot of very sweet Christians who, you know, you want to talk about the Trinity. Oh, that's all too complicated for me. I just got to love Jesus. So the downgrading in the Christian box is, I think, quite a significant thing. And yet, and then in parallel with that, there's on the secular side, there's another kind of downgrading that we've just alluded to, which is the objectification of knowledge. Knowledge is facts and data and science, and it probably is on the same faith versus reason polarization, but it's gone the other way. And so the orphan in the middle is any rich view of knowledge, and yet any casual reading of the New Testament will tell you that knowledge is heavily emphasized. You know, grow in grace and the knowledge of God. I mean, how many times does Paul want to invoke knowledge? The great Ephesians 1 prayer is, I want you to know. And so we're missing something. That's how I responded. I just like your feedback on that.
Yeah, I straight away thought of Paul saying, you know, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Yeah, it's a really sad thing that we've ended up with this polarization. I mean, you think of the idea of, you know, our reasonable faith. You know, it's there need be no polarity between these things at all. You know, it is those of us, you know, who do acknowledge Jesus as Lord should feel almost compelled by that, to want to understand, to want to know the world. Know what it is that's been created and how it works. At the same time, those who see themselves as, you know, we're all about logic and analysis and reason, I think are naive in not understanding how the very notion of reason itself is based upon a belief. You know, as we've often talked about before, you can't. You know, for people who push that, one of the great intellectual sins is circular reasoning. You know, beginning with where you're trying to get to at the end. But of course, you can't mount an argument. You can't mount a traditional Aristotelian syllogism for why reason works. You have to assume reason for the argument to actually work, which leaves you saying, well, what is it about the world? What is it about life that makes this a useful tool?
Exactly. And this is where our recent conversations have not been surprising to me on the secular side. You know, I mean, I'm quite used to that battle of fought it all my life with you and with others. And so I'm used to that. The real illumination to me came on the Christian side. And how do we take this word knowledge and renovate it? Yeah. How do we actually make it a key ingredient of the discipleship model? And in order to do that, we need I think a paradigm shift around the word, which is what you will offer us and our conversation will offer. And that moves to, in a sense, what I've got is the B space, which I'll share the screen again just to get that going. The B is the vision. So can we see my screen again there, Mark?
Yep.
Like, vision is incredibly important for Christians. Christians of all people should be people of vision, because our whole theology and faith is structured around hope and hope of an end time. So the vision that I think is relevant on this knowledge thing, what immediately struck me was this wonderful verse. I think it occurs twice, at least in the Old Testament. Certainly Zechariah says it, that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Anne and I have been doing a lot of reading of the Old Testament. And what is striking us is how intent God wanted understanding.
Mm.
and how the prophets attacked false understanding of who God was, not actually. And he didn't like fake knowledge. He didn't, Pharisaical rules. Isaiah we're reading at the moment. He just hits them, and he wanted people who understood in their souls who God was.
Yeah.
So that what that showed to me, as you can see in this model here, is that God, as we share this wonderful vision from Genesis of cosmic rule, he's equipping humanity to rule and govern the cosmos. That's the great kingship model that we see in the scriptures. And yet we need to go inside that model and say, well, hang on, let's go further, because this is not like a Trump-like vision of egotistical power. He wants knowledge that's conscious and deliberate. He wants agency mediated by humans. In other words, there's a lot of education of these humans who are going to rule the universe to do it very deliberately according to the character and will of God.
And it's a knowledge, that it's a knowing that blesses.
Yes, it's a knowing that blesses. It's a knowing that leads to social good.
Yeah. And the good of the earth.
And the good of the earth, yes. I mean, the actual passage that Anne and I were contemplating, in the depths of Isaiah, and you're I don't know where we were, I think 32, and he's criticizing the fool. And what was so obviously the idea of wisdom and fool, it's right in the heart of knowledge, and as a matter of fact, wisdom might be a better word to use than knowledge, but whatever.
Yeah, I like to use it.
Yeah, he's criticizing the fool, but what struck us immediately was the outcome of foolishness was socially oppressive behavior.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he goes on, he says the fool practices ungodliness, spreads error concerning the Lord, which that struck us. Wow. He's criticizing, we know they were false prophets. Who were backing the the Egyptian alliance against Assyria, but nonetheless, error concerning the Lord. They got their theology wrong. Yeah. And the outcome were that the fool leaves the hungry empty, and from the thirsty he withholds water. So that what you've just said about this knowledge is not just some academic curiosity. Yeah. It's equipping people to mediate blessing or not to the world.
One of the marks in the Proverbs of the wise king, it's a bit like, Jesus says, they'll know you're my disciples by your love. And in the Proverbs, it's a little bit, they'll know you're the wise king by all the widow and the orphan and all the people who are oppressed will be blessed. They'll have an advocate in the king. That's a mark of wisdom.
Yeah, and so, and all equally, wisdom defines kingship.
Yeah.
And so what I began to see, if I now connect what we're talking about directly into what I also talked about around discipleship, was this was the paradigm shift for me, where I think I've been guilty of the baggage of a mental model of discipleship as, a stereotype of pietistic behavior. And every time people talk about, we're doing something in church at the moment, and it's earnest and well-intentioned and on the whole good, but you can't get out of the feeling this is very stereotypical. Pray, read the Bible, go to church, witness, and it's a fairly tedious list of requirements. Whereas I began to see, no, hang on, we are meant to be transformers of situations. And I'll just quickly share the screen again, because there's a great little model there of what I'm talking about. Can you see the screen again?
Yeah.
It's this middle model here, where the transformation recorded in Genesis 1 verse 2 from, is it tohu, boohoo?
Yeah, talk about boohoo, yeah.
There were three kind of vectors of transformation: formlessness into form, unproductive energy into productive energy. But the third one is into light.
Yeah.
And that, I know you're going to pick up on it, but to say one of the critical transformations God wants is light.
Yeah.
And that is, so bringing light into situations is an aspect, therefore, of discipleship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is part of the new discipleship model. You know, what if you said, no, discipleship is being able to bring light into situations, you know, personal situations, family situations, political situations, biblical situations, whatever. Bringing light really, really matters. It's central to the purposes of God.
Yeah, and again, it's light that blesses. I mean, it's really easy to kind of hear that language, and if you're still stuck in that pietistic and religious mindset, then you'd say, oh yeah, of course, you bring light in. That's part of, you know, to use one of your phrases, that's part of what you need if you're going to be moral police. You know, if so we can shine and go, oh, you're wrong, that's bad, rather than light which illumines everything and shows glory, you know, that blesses and shows glory.
Exactly. Now, what you've just said there was, I think, something which is important and we could build on, this showing glory. In that, I mean, one of my favourite passages, I'm sure yours, I know it was my favourite passage of the patristics, was the burning bush passage, where, you know, Moses saw what at face value looked like a dry bush. But what was illuminated, he saw the reality of that bush, which was the glory shining. And nowadays, of course, we of all people would know that actually isn't even a metaphor, because the molecular energy in that bush could blow the world up, you know, if it was unlocked. So it was the glory shining out of situations is very important. And I can also remember a series of talks I heard from one of Watchman Nee's cohorts, wonderful old man called Stephen Kong. I wouldn't agree with everything he says, but then again, he was just such a magnificent Christian. And a lot of what he said was absolutely breathtaking. One thing he said, which I'll never forget, he said, this is the key aspect of leadership. Seeing the glory in others. That's how he read that. Moses was being taught, if Moses thought the Israelites are total losers, they're sinners, that's how I'll name them. He couldn't lead them. And if we want to lead anyone, kids, our own kids, we have to see the glory in them. And if we can't, then we're not at first base.
Well, you know, in my work on leadership, the last 20 or so years, you know, I've my way of saying that has been to use the word brilliance, because glory tends to stop a lot of conversations. Brilliance lets it keep going, and that I've said the same thing, that you know, you can't lead well if you can't see the brilliance in other people and know how to bring about the conversations that help people realize the brilliance that they do have and find ways to bring that to the fore. And one of the things I've often said is it's pretty difficult to do that if you don't have a sense of that for yourself. But it's, you know, which could sound terribly narcissistic and self-serving, except that for me, it's always shaped by this on behalf of, this sense of, it's not for myself, it's on behalf of the ones that I serve.
Well, when you say that, Mark, just to make this practical, this brilliance idea, you know, which would be, I mean, we would be saying a disciple has to unlock the brilliance in situations and in people. Now, can you just quickly tell the story of, you know, I can remember you helping people in the school system and they were quite broken, and you had a conversation that unlocked them from memory. Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, oh yeah, it does. Yeah, I'm still in touch with a few of them. It's quite a while back now, but it was there were about 40 or 50 schools that were identified about 15 years ago in one of the states here in Australia as being there was a program set up for them because they were regarded as the worst schools in the state on every metric. And I had the privilege of working with the principal of one of those schools who'd just been appointed to it. And she had been on one of the 3-day retreats that I've run for many, many years now. And she said to me, you know, I can see what's going to happen. She said, it's like you often talk about this idea of, this abstract idea of, you know, the transformed school or the better school or whatever else. And she said it'll be like going into the great educational supermarket with your trolley, and you've got your check, and you grab this program and that program and this program and stick them all in, pedagogy, curriculum, da 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 da, and supposedly that's going to make for transformation. And she said, you know, I don't buy it anymore, and you know, would you come and work with me? And it all started, we took the 50 teachers away for 2 days, and we had no other agenda than 2 questions. Literally, we hadn't organised what was going to happen through the whole 2 days. We just started with 2 questions. And the first question was, why did you become a teacher? And, you know, this is your world, you know the story here. And 3 hours later, 50 people had told the most extraordinary stories. And it was all hard stuff. I mean, it was lots of laughing, hilarity, but there were tears and the end of it, and they told me this afterwards, was they just looked around the room at each other and had this sense of, I know you in a way I've never known, or in some cases I've actually resisted knowing, because I've always seen you as a problem, and I've never wanted to believe there was more to you than what I just heard in that story. And so we asked them to spend the rest of the day just talking with each other about what they had seen and felt. And the next day we asked them the question, what do you really think about the kids? And because all the stories came up, you know, about the brilliant kids and the kids that, you know, got expelled or whatever. And just the heart in it all, again, even from the ones that teachers thought this wouldn't be their own disposition, but you know, everybody just loves the kids, you know, and that's what really mattered to them. And again, at the end of it, they were just, you know, as they said afterwards, we just found ourselves thinking about each other and thinking about the school and thinking about the kids. That is knowing, right? Knowing who we were, knowing what we were trying to do in a way that we'd never, ever seen before. Those couple of questions and the conversations that were ignited by it brought light. And we followed it up working with teachers in small groups, and the same thing happened in the recollections that teachers had of odd moments of teaching. And I deliberately said I want to hear the odd ones, not the obvious ones. And it was in those odd moments that people realised, you know, actually I've seen some amazing things happen with kids. And we started to say, well, what if you paid more attention to those than all the supposed rules about how you're supposed to teach? And as they did that, their teaching changed more consistently. And anyway, the school has become something of a model for a lot of others. Although interestingly, the principal and several of the teachers and myself, we told this story at a number of conferences for educators. And of course, the principals and teachers just all wanted to come up and talk about it. But the people from the department and people from the universities, from the education faculties, none of them wanted to know about it.
Well, you know, that is a very, very pertinent and powerful story. And because at face value, I mean, this is part of the seamless world that now we inhabit. You know, you've told a story about you interacting with people, and there was no way that they were Christians, that you had a Christian hat on.
No.
But what you did in this model of discipleship that's developing, you shed light onto that situation in the form of directing the conversation towards brilliance.
Yeah.
And that was your, in what we're really developing here, being a disciple.
One other thing about it too is that in the conversation, and I've shared this story many times, as you can imagine, and one of the things that I often do to lead into the story, especially when I'm working with people in corporations, is I ask them, I tell them a bit about the background of the school and the terrible statistics and all the rest of it. And I say, so how are we wired to go into a conversation like this? And people always say, well, it's to find the problem and find a solution for the problem. And I say to them, well, what would happen if I in some way or another, I asked that group of 50, what's wrong? And everyone knows that it would just spiral into this ugly conversation. And likewise, if you ask, how do we fix it? It only stays buoyant for a very short time before it descends into the same horrible place. And And that, in a sense, to me, is exactly the same mindset as the religious and pietistic mindset. It just sees everything in terms of what's wrong and what's right, and to think in terms of brilliance and light and God's glory is just a phenomenally different place to approach things.
Well, it is, and of course, if we put this into theological terminology, we would say this traditional pietistic religious language is really short on eschatology.
Yeah.
We could argue that, what you're doing is declaring a space of hope, because at one level, the hope you would have for reformation of that system could be seen as being futile.
Yeah.
But you would know within yourself that actually I'm on the winning side, because I'm actually on God's side here. I'm declaring from a belief you're all made in the image of God. I'm declaring from a belief we're going to govern the cosmos. I'm declaring from a belief in the resurrection that's affirmed all that hope. So I can speak hope into situations.
Yeah.
And what you and I know is that a lot of this language does lead to conversations at night over a glass of wine. Where are you coming from?
Always. Exactly. That's it. Always the question. Where are you coming from?
Yeah, because I like what you're saying, and I'd love it. And then that. When you mentioned how the bureaucrats and the academics don't like that, it did remind me of the kind of oppression of the kings in Israel that, didn't want authentic conversations going on. They really didn't.
It's interesting, when you think of so much of the prophets and, of course, Jesus, you think of the most scathing comments, and they are for the religious people, they're for the Pharisees, they're for people who have taken this incredible universal, as big as the creation story, and packaged it up into this horrible little truncated religious box, and they're the ones that consistently come in for the rebuke, in all of this.
So I'm sure that has intrigued people, and the trajectory of the conversation is, just to go back to the diagram, what we've covered is the parameters, the A to B of this knowledge, and yet we need an idea. We need something that's going to give us more than motivation and aspiration here, which is where this space of what we call C, which is the hypothesis, which is a big idea, comes in. Now, I don't want you to go too far on this one, because that's going to set an agenda for our second and possibly third interview. Who knows how long we'll chat. But there's a new paradigm for discipleship that is offered, which is taking this word knowledge and reframing it as actually through the lens of faith, hope, and love. I'd just like you to snapshot that.
Yeah.
Briefly, and then we'll close off and get ready for to develop that in subsequent talks.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Do you want to take off your lovely diagram? It's interesting that, the words faith, hope, and love, they are almost universally talked about as being virtues. And people will say they're either moral virtues or they're spiritual virtues, religious virtues, something like that. And of course, the three words together, everyone's alluding to 1 Corinthians 13, the chapter that we all think about love. And to go back to where you started about the kind of sense of pitting faith against reason, you'd think a chapter here, it's about love, and that's what really matters. I mean, that just seems to shore up that idea that, it's faith that really matters. It's not reason. But I have for a long time argued that 1 Corinthians 13, sure, it is about love in that that's what he makes central to his answer to something, his own hypothesis. But the issue that he's grappling with is not about virtue or piety or anything like that. The issue he's grappling with is knowledge. It's about what it means to know. And you've got that right from the beginning of 1 Corinthians. With the whole idea of, it's the foolishness of God has made foolish the wisdom of men. And it's this idea that the gospel story is on, if you see it through any other lens other than God's wisdom and who made the world and what he is seeking to do with it, it just looks ridiculous. To be talking about uh, a Jewish man in the time of the Roman Empire. Talk about a Jewish man, a carpenter from Nowheresville, Nazareth, who ends up crucified and then raised from the dead. I mean, in terms of everything about Plato and Aristotle and everybody else about how they've said how the world works. I mean, this is just from the political perspective, a Jewish man crucified. From the philosophical perspective, resurrection of the dead. It's just nonsense. It just seems the most ridiculous story. And yet here Paul is saying, well, it turns out that is actually the wisdom and power of God. And all the way through the rest of the book, this notion of knowledge is still there. And it's there in a particular way that if you think about how the ideas of the philosophers of the past were present, in Paul's own day, they're not present in the sense that people are reading texts about philosophy or they're having conversations with each other about the nature of knowledge. The way it's present is the nexus between knowledge, education, and elitism. So that it is only the educated who can be regarded as being knowledgeable, and it is only the elite who are educated. And so when you look in 1 Corinthians, as he starts to get into the meat of the issues, the dramas that are going on within the community between each other, there's this issue of elitism that is there all the way through. Who's top dog here? Who are the ones who are the wise? And Paul is flipping all of these assumptions all the way through. Now, when he gets to 1 Corinthians 13, it just hit me many years ago reading those first 3 verses. And when Paul says, what if I possessed all knowledge but did not have love? And because I think at the time I had been spending so much time reading the classical philosophers, it just hit me between the eyes that here was the most succinct statement I can find, not only in the Bible, but even in all classical literature, of what was the aim of all those philosophers. And that was exhaustive knowledge, to know everything. And Paul says, what if I pulled it off, but didn't have love? And you can be tempted again to think, oh, we'll see, all that reason and knowledge, that doesn't matter. What really matters is love. Paul's not saying that. Paul is effectively saying, if I somehow, seemingly, for the sake of the argument, seem to pull this off, frankly, it would all be distorted. All of my knowing would be distorted. And so he goes on to the end of it. He describes love, not seeking your own good and all the rest of it, all of which is incredibly radical in a world that was completely about self-interest. But he gets to the end of it and says, now we know in part. One day we shall know in full. He says, so then these 3 remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. So the issue is it's the knowledge question, right? Still, okay, we know the story of Jesus is in fact the wisdom of God. We know one day that is going to cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. But for the moment, we don't see it like that. For the moment, we glimpse darkly. We don't get it all. So then, how does our knowing sustain itself in this now but not yet context? And he says, so then these 3 remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest is love. He's not doing a flip back from, well, the knowledge thing's too hard, let's just go with some sort of religious virtues. What he's saying is, this is how we know. The components are all knowledge is a faith. All knowledge is a belief. All knowledge is a projection forward into something, a hope. And all knowledge, all knowing, is an embrace. It's a drawing to others and to yourself. And my argument is that in the larger scheme of things, is not just that faith, hope, and love are not virtues in some moral sense, but ways of knowing. But not just that they are like the ways of knowing for Paul and his Christian friends, but in fact, this is what it is intrinsically to be human. That if we are the creature, not the creator, that all knowing of all people at all time, no matter what they profess about God, is always a knowing that is through faith, through hope, and through love. That is the character of what it means to know as a human being.
That's wonderful, Mark. That is. I think it oxygenates the idea of knowledge. But it does more than that. It gives us a pathway which we can explore as to how one can work on this, find language in that, and that's really transformational. But that most of us have choices in that are fairly practical day by day. It definitely points to something that's pragmatically true, that this secular concept of knowledge as information processing, I've got a book there, it's a unified theory of knowledge, I think it's called that, by one of the kind of computer philosophers. And it's an amazingly limited book. It's just information processing, whereas that's actually not the truth. The truth is not data, the truth is not things, but what is the truth then? Well, if data and things are the received world, you need the light of faith, hope, and love shining on them. And as you say, this is not in the slightest even Christian language. It's actually all wise human language.
And I would say it's not even like a post-fall knowing, if you like, but as we can talk about maybe next time round, is that I anchor this back into Genesis 1 and 2, not just 3.
Well, that sounds to me like a great teaser to finish on. And we'll do what Dickens did in his novels. He finished every chapter with people saying, no, what's that? And the next chapter's going to be about. So, mate, thank you very much. It's been wonderful. And I'm so glad to have you back on the airwaves.
It's been great to be with you, Tony.
Okay. Speak soon.